pleasure for me to welcome everyone here and such a wonderful crowd as well to the 2008 William James Lecture on Religious Experience. I would ask, before I say anything further, if you'd please turn off cell phones, galactic transponders, or whatever you may have on you that can make noise, okay? And I would also note that after this evening's lecture and after the lecture we'll have a question and answer period. You're all invited to join our honored guest at a reception in the Brown Room, which is when you go out of here, turn right, go as far to the north as you can go and you'll hit it. So we'll look forward to seeing everyone there and you'll have a chance perhaps to meet our speaker. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you the lectures themselves before we move to the main event when I call on my esteemed colleague, Professor Leila Ahmed, to introduce our speaker this afternoon. In 1968, a generous gift of the John Lindsley Fund established at Harvard Divinity School the William James Lectures on Religious Experience for the purpose of having an outstanding scholar or scholars, and in a few years we've had more than one, lecture annually on some aspect of religious experience. Mr. Thayer Lindsley's long-standing interest in William James as a teacher and in his religious ideas made it seem appropriate to the trustees of the fund to establish these lectures in honor of James, the great Harvard pragmatist, making also particular reference in the title they chose to James's most famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Cushing Strout, professor of English and American Studies at Cornell University, presented the inaugural lecture on October 14, 1970. Many distinguished scholars have since followed. I can't name them all here this afternoon, but naming a few from the impressive list should remind us of the diversity of approaches and the quality of the speakers represented in the annals of this lectureship. Herbert Fingerette, Robert J. Lifton, Robert Coles, Charles Long, Wayne Proudfoot, Martha Nussbaum, Hilary Putnam, Jonathan Z. Smith, Richard R. Niebuhr, Gayanath Obiasekere, and Bernie McGinn. I'm extremely pleased that we are welcoming today so distinguished a scholar as Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, University Professor and Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University, to present the 2008 James Lecture on Religious Experience. She will be introduced in just a moment by our colleague, Professor Leila Ahmed, the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Divinity here at Harvard Divinity School, whom I will introduce to those of you who don't know her. Professor Ahmed joined this faculty in 1999 as the first Professor of Women's Studies in Religion. She precedes me as a member of this faculty and was appointed to the Victor S. Thomas Chair in 2003. Prior to her appointment at HDS, she was Professor of Women's Studies and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her personal memoir of growing up in Egypt and then moving to studies in England and then ultimately coming to the United States is maybe known to many of you in her memoir, this memoir, A Border Passage, which has received wide acclaim since its publication several years ago. Her other books include Women and Gender in Islam, The Historical Roots of a Modern Debate, and Edward William Lane, a study of his life and work and of British ideas of the Middle East in the 19th century, as well as many articles. Professor Ahmed's current research and writing is focused on Islam in America and in particular issues of women and gender. And it's now my pleasure to call on her to introduce our guest. Leila.
Thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction. Now it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak as this year's William James Lecturer on Religious Experience. Professor Spivak, who teaches English and the politics of culture, is University Professor and Director at of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. This semester, she's also visiting Professor at Princeton University. Professor Spivak was educated at Calcutta University, from which she obtained her BA in English in 1959, after which she attended Cornell University, where she took her MA and PhD degrees in comparative literature in 1967. Over the course of this time, she also won a fellowship to Girton College in Cambridge and spent the summer teaching at the Yates International School, Summer School, is it Sligo? Sligo Island. Professor Spivak's major books include Myself I Must Remake, 1974, of Grammatology, 1976, which was her translation with critical introduction of Derrida, Jacques Derrida's De la Grammatologie. In Other Worlds, 1987, The Post-Colonial Critic, 1988, Outside the Teaching Machine, 1993, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, 1999, Mahaswati Devi's Imaginary Maps, 1999, Death of a Discipline, 2003, and Other Asias, 2007. Widely recognized at once as major works in post-colonial and theory studies, each of Professor Spivak's works also distinctly marked landmark moments in the history of the Academy in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Her books, and indeed also many of her articles, among them, for example, her Can the Subaltern Speak, introduced and laid the groundwork of new theoretical and philosophical insights and perspectives that thenceforth became integral parts of academic analysis and conversations in post-colonial studies and women's studies, to be sure, but also, in fact, right across the disciplines and throughout the Academy. Today, for example, Professor Spivak's work is studied here at the Divinity School, where it is regularly set in such courses as Contemporary Conversations and the Study of Religion, our required doctoral seminar, just as it is in many other departments across the university. Indeed, Professor Spivak's influence has been felt also well beyond the Academy in art, architecture, law, political science, and curatorial practices in the United States and internationally. The list of international universities at which Professor Spivak has taught, for instance, include Thank you. University Paul Valéry, University of British Columbia, Goethe Universität in Frankfurt, Riyadh University, Saudi Arabia, the University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong, the University of Hawaii, and the Center for Studies in Social Sciences in Calcutta. Professor Spivak's awards and honors are no less numerous than her international professorial appointments. She's been, for example, a Kent Fellow, a Guggenheim Fellow, and has held fellowships at the National Humanities Institute, the Center for the Humanities at Wesleyan, the Humanities Research Center at the Australian University, the Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, the Rockefeller Foundation at Bellagio. In addition, Professor Spivak has been the recipient of several honorary doctorates, among them from the University of London and the University of Toronto. All of this represents only a partial list of Professor Spivak's extraordinary honors and contributions, but I will stop here in the interest of not taking up any more time myself and giving the floor now to Professor Spivak. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you, Leila. I'm in awe of actually standing here and giving this talk, and I want to confess right away that she defeated me. I'm not going to talk about someone unknown. I'm going to talk about Shahrudadevi. She defeated me this first time around. I couldn't quite do it, so I'm going to share my failure with you. I'm going to try again, but I have accepted this invitation because I want to celebrate Sharadamuni Chattopadhyay, born Mukhopadhyay in the village of Jairambati in 1853 in what was then Bengal province in India, and she died in the city of Calcutta at the age of 67 in 1920. The feminist literary critic most often, you can hear me in the back, yes? The feminist literary critic most often moves towards sociological methods and shares a platform with the historian when she attempts to represent great singular females. Or she goes the post-colonial, post-structuralist route. Neither of these will suffice for me. Many have accused subaltern studies and post-structuralism of being sympathetic to fundamentalisms today, or perhaps through a sympathy with the intuition of the transcendental of giving fuel to the fundamentalists. This can surely be a problem, but we don't believe that the cause of internalized secularism is served by ignoring the importance of the intuition of the transcendental, without which we can neither mourn nor punish. What lesson can I receive from Shahruda, who inhabited the cusp between subalternity and the colonial urban, differently from the two men who made it possible for her? She is so often, she's well known, but she is so often swamped with divinization or with this sort of maternalization that I have tried to look at her as a person who does not believe in the immortality of the soul. I've tried to look at her, look through my admiration at her, as inhabiting a field of contradictions. What lesson can I receive from her? The humanities train the imagination to approach the other. In the contemporary context, and if undertaken seriously, the humanities systematically displace what, in the interest of time, I will simply call the religious transcendental into the philosophical literary, where the transcendental marks no more than a limit. I should mention here that this distinction between religion and the humanities may be no more than a disciplinary convenience. One can think belief and imagination in other ways. At the age of 5, Shahruda was married to the eccentric visionary Gadadhar Chattopadhyay. This man would qualify for William James's lectures on a variety of religious experience. I was tempted to go through the saintliness stuff, but then I thought, no, I'm speaking on her, and enough has been said about him. Indeed, Partha Chatterjee has written of, and I quote, his insatiable curiosity about every variety of religious experience, unquote. In other words, deliberately establishing a kind of kinship there. I am a student of literature, and Gadadhar Chattopadhyay's metaphoric sensibility has always seemed to me akin to William Blake's. In the latter half of the 19th century, William Blake's credit was not very high among academic teachers of literature. It is interesting to see that a contemporary professor of English literature in Calcutta compared Gadadhar's sensibility to Wordsworth's, and I quote, "The principal of the General Assembly's institution, now Scottish Church College, was then Professor W. Hastie, an Englishman. Lecturing on Wordsworth's The Excursion and the poet's nature mysticism," and by the way, Vivekananda was in this class as a student, mysticism led the professor to speak of those states of deep meditation in which outer consciousness is lost. He told his students that such states were only possible as the result of purity and concentration, and they had anyway become extremely rare in modern times. I have known only one person, he added, who has achieved such meditation, and that is Ramakrishna, which is of course Gadadhar Chattopadhyay's sacred name, Ramakrishna of Dakshineshwar. You will understand it better if you visit this saint. In the first few years of the marriage, Shahruda saw her husband only sporadically. In 1872, apparently ruled by a strong wish to join him, she walked the 60-odd miles from Jairambati to Dakshineshwar, where he resided, walking with a group, as was customary at that time among the less affluent rural population. There is a well-known story of how, left behind by her walking companions, she encountered murderous thieves or dacoits on open terrain at dusk, and how, by simply saying she was their daughter and naming herself, she won them over until they looked after her and accompanied her to Dakshineshwar the next day. This is once again given, this is a simple story, but it is so inscribed within a kind of religious discourse that one doesn't really think about what was actually going on. This is proof of either excellence in role-playing or seeing propinquity in everyone, certainly a lack of fear, but also great persuasiveness. I will later suggest that it would be more interesting to look at her without being committed to divinization. Here she teaches me how to cope with violence by the strength of the imagination, entering into the other's space so that my statements are credible and persuasive. In 1886, Gadadhar died of throat cancer. Shahruda outlived him by 34 years. This is her life. It is generally assumed that her husband trained her into the religious life and that she was indeed a worthy recipient of this training. The only contemporary who repeated that she was greater than he was Narendranath Datta, a brilliant young law student from an affluent urban family with tendencies toward reformist Hinduism. Partha Chatterjee and Shumit Sarkar, contemporary historians, have written with a degree of contempt about Gadadhar from the point of view of rational skepticism, unable to cover the imaginative distance. And, undoubtedly because of gender politics, critical theory has paid no attention to Sharada Muni. I am not interested in presenting her as Gadadhar's best disciple or his superior. There is no doubt that being married to Gadadhar allowed her to develop into the extraordinary woman that she was. It is also true that given the patriarchal caste of the majority of marriages then and now, her potential would probably have been quenched if she had been married to an ordinary man. This reflects the nearly universal gender politics against which we fight. It leads to a ranked representation of women as inferior, or its legitimation by reversal, women judged as invariably superior. My attempt will be to celebrate the extraordinary woman without comparative reference to her male companion. It is a difficult task for the imagination. Culture dictates procedure and thus interferes. W.E.B. Du Bois was a pupil of William James, as you know. I am reading one of his autobiographies, Dusk of Dawn, written when he was 70, as I confront the difficult task of celebrating Sharada Muni. Of himself he says that he was, and I quote, whirled around in the zeitgeist. That is true of all of us, of course, but Du Bois had tried to understand that zeitgeist and to change it. I should like to think that Sharada Muni also tried to understand it and to change it. Her sayings have been recorded abundantly, but again, I was looking at a very recent book brought out by many of her, as I hate the word, but I don't know what word to use, devotees. And again, there is really no attempt at reading what she has written, but always insisting on the sacred and divinized message. That is true of all of us, but Du Bois tried to understand and change. I should like to think that Sharada Muni also tried to understand it and to change it. Her followers have known this, and the account is not unknown outside of Asia. In attempting this celebration, I am no archivist. There is plenty of excellent published prose on her. The only possible difference would be that I think of her as showing the forthrightness available to rural women. And this comes out of 20 years of very close experience of rural women at the bottom, absolute bottom of the pile. I do about 3 semesters worth of work in terms of contact hours among such very poor people every year, and this thing of forthrightness being available to rural women, she was able to show this to a much larger world because the 2 unusual men in her life inhabited an accent that they played like an instrument differently. There can be no doubt that Gadadhar was an original. It is difficult to say that his utter disregard of the conventional outlines of subjectivity and his broad and communicative ecstatic disposition were produced by those times. And I really find Chatterjee's account of Keshav Chandra Sen and Ramakrishna incredibly inadequate in this matter. It's a failure of imagination. Let us rather think that the times or the historical moment as accent site were ready to construct him in a certain way. Texts such as the Kathamrita, recording his conversation, or Nabojugir Mahapurush, presenting the lives of his associates, give us proof of this, the construction of this ecstatic, unusual, original man in a certain way that was provided by the times, as it were. By contrast, Narendranath is more recognizably a product of the times, and his originality is best described by that impressive formula which many of you will recognize, perhaps all, I hope. The human being makes its own history, but does not choose the specific part it plays. By the time Shahrudadevi came into her own, both of these men had disappeared from her life. Through her, we have access to a woman space, which it isn't always easy to find in that period. But she's also open, veiled, partially veiled, unveiled, to a male population of monks and householders that is slightly different from this earlier group. In her, we therefore see little of what has been defined as mimicry. So in a sense, when I look at someone of this sort who has at her disposal no discourse that would match this kind of influence stuff, I feel that she also teaches me to think another way about influence, as it were. So, I mean, not only these two very different men, but also the time and rural subalternity and the urban Bhadralok space. She has been constituted as a classic good woman, modest, unassuming, and full of maternal love. Quote, mother is the sign available to her to inhabit for the expression of her singularity. Mother is also a universalizable sementeme for constructing an ethical semiosis. If I had enough time, I would go into Melanie Klein, but of course this is not the moment. Yet to define her in terms of maternal qualities and to say that that reflects a perennial Indian ideal, which is said again and again, reminds me of Tilly Olson's Tell Me a Riddle. Sharada Muni's discursive resources came from the Dvaita world of subaltern Hinduism, overlaid with modernized Vedanta. And it's amazing if one, I mean, this really is not a one-time only lecture. This requires a kind of long 14-week reading of how, in fact, she instrumentalizes and manages, extremely intelligent woman, how she actually manages to inhabit both worlds without the discourse of, let's say, rationality, which Vivekananda certainly had access to. Sharada Muni's discursive resources came from the Dvaita world of subaltern Hinduism overlaid with modernized Vedanta. I want to learn to distinguish the clear ethical script that emerges from this discourse. In this, I can, of course, be helped by the detailed and careful biographies written by people with firm faith in her divinity. It is just that I cannot share in that conclusion. It doesn't seem to me to be productive. If it is because I did not see her in the flesh that I cannot feel, as her best biographer has written, that, I quote, all the translations are mine, she had come as the beneficent mother of all creatures. A mother's love need not be explained to the child, end of quote. Then I should like to point out that the biography was still written, the explanation still offered. And if the argument is made by another excellent biographer, and I quote, although her human aspect was more powerful, it is unnatural to try depicting a character only with phenomenal details when the internal divine aspect manifested itself easily and naturally, phenomenal and transcendental mingled in sweet harmony, and the human and divine embraced as did the divine and human, and revealed themselves in an inseparable form. This is the first biography which came out in the 50s, Brahmacharya Akha Chaitanya. As I say, the translations are mine. I have to confess that I would like to be able to read in Sharada Muni's conviction of divinity, as she was indeed convinced, a powerful intending subject finding its discursive expression even as it locates its limits, subaltern female intelligence repeatedly bringing transcendentality into crisis by putting it into a double bind with the details of the everyday. I must repeat that this is not a clean rupture. What the biographers and devotees wonder at repeatedly as her simplicity in spite of her divinity may be seen as her location in already available discursive practice for the expression of difference. The historian Nimai Sadhan Bose has simply declared, and I quote, that she was an exceptional historical character upon whom the specific method and rules of the hair-splitting differentiation of the phenomenal and the transcendental could not always be applied. As a reader of literature, I take refuge in that not always, the flip side of, but sometimes, yes. I want to be haunted by that transgressive side, the times when they can. The flip side, her time-bound humanity. In that interest, I have myself performed a tiny cultural ritual. I have never before called her by her secular name, Shahrudadevi Chattopadhyay. I have never before called her by her secular name, nor indeed have I heard her called as such. She is usually called Shahrudadevi, or in the Bengali pronunciation, Shahrudadevi would be the other one. But she is also called, in context and often, Sri Sri Ma or Sri Ma or even Ma. When I went to speak to the nuns who have established themselves in her name, the two most senior intellectual nuns, one of them has known me since I was a child, intellectual nuns said to me, "Do not be afraid, she is the mother who takes away fear, just speak of the fact that she loves everyone and people will want to hear more about her." But that is not my way. I respect her greatly, but I cannot be moved by anyone into the sort of devotion that brings forth fearlessness by naming. When she is lying on her deathbed, dying of Kala Azar, a deadly disease caused, and I give these details because one needs to know that she lived in this kind of circumstance also, not just in Calcutta, a deadly disease caused by the bite of infected female sandfly, thriving in cracks and crevices of mud-plastered houses, heaps of cow dung in rat burrows, in bushes and vegetations around the houses, lowering immunity, causing persistent fever, anemia, liver and spleen enlargement, she says, in response to another's anguish, I quote, "What fear?" She displaces it upon Godadhar and says, "You have seen him. What fear?" There's the transcendental divinization discourse. But this is not her main message. Having responded to the person's anguish, she gives positive advice, always ethical, always conditional. And I invite you to look through all the stuff that has been collected and see this tremendous characteristic. And I go on quoting, "If you want peace, do not notice anyone's faults. Note faults in yourself." Her advice nearly always involves effort. Learn to make the world yours. The Bengali word apnar signifies greater intimacy than just yours. Learn to make the world yours. No one is other. The world is yours. End of quote. I can take this more seriously. She situates fear in a space of custom and moves to ethical effort even in her last recorded speech, which is this. Sushmita Ghosh's doctoral dissertation, Banglar Nari Mukti Andolon এবং Sri Ma Sharoda Devi, that's the feminist movement in Bengal, and Sri Ma Sharoda Devi, collects a great deal of information about Sharoda Muni, establishing her as an unusual woman of great personal strength, advancing women's liberation through Indian ideals. This is the first book of its kind and deserves praise, but it establishes Sharoda Muni without her subalternity, though it mentions it often. She was only a rural woman, she was only from the village, but what comes out is a very Tagorean kind of middle-class person, only these kinds of utterances, nothing of her daily use of that Dvaita discourse, which I have defined in a certain way, which you will see in a minute. This is the first book of its kind and deserves praise, but it establishes Sharoda Muni without her subalternity. In this book, there are no instances of the contradictions between her statements, reflecting the conflict of intelligence and permissible discourse, and no indication of what I have called her habitation in the Dvaita universe. And I'll give you a little definition of the Dvaita structure of feeling. Structure of feeling, that expression comes to us from Raymond Williams' wonderful work. The unanticipatable emergence of the supernatural in the natural. The tenacious dog on the mountain path is suddenly King Dharma for Yudhishthira in the last book of the Mahabharata. This is just an example. Rather unlike any sustained notion of incarnation. Perhaps this is why the Sanskrit word for incarnation, avatar, has nothing to do with putting on flesh. It means rather a come-down being, avatarana. Dr. Ghosh starts from a conviction of Sharoda Muni's divinity. When she says of her own opportunity to do doctoral research in a history department, I quote this at length, really from within, as it were, because this is what I would find to be the easiest path to take. I come from this kind of discourse, and so in a spirit of autocritique and the reason why I've been defeated, as it were, I talk a little bit about this. When she says of her own opportunity to do doctoral research in a history department, I quote, "Finally, it was Ma who made it possible. I can only understand it metaphorically with irony. I cannot seriously say that the invitation to deliver the William James lecture was Sharada Muni's doing, as I would have to if I followed through there. And people do say this kind of thing seriously. Ghosh writes as if every ideal stated in the plans made by Vivekananda and the women who followed him is successful in today's world. Then I cannot forget that when I spoke to the headmistress of the school that Ghosh describes as reflecting the ideals of an Indian golden age, and this is from that other experience that I referred to, the experience every year, in order to place there an extraordinary tribal student from Purulia district, of whom I have written elsewhere, Shamoli, I was told by the headmistress that she would be out of place in the dormitory because the other resident girls would make her feel extremely uncomfortable, mocking her humble background. It was good advice. Shamoli didn't go and then died of encephalitis. It was good advice, but it certainly did show that inevitably the ideals have entered the mainstream of the urban middle class. In this respect, the schools differ from the social work. Dr. Ghosh is perfectly astute in saying that the idea was that it was no use giving equality from above, and I think we can, as we talk about things like Millennium Goals, we can remember this perhaps. This is not something that we should simply reject. No use giving equality from above, and that the only way to development was to raise the spirit, or to quote Du Bois' unfettered communication with the stars. You remember he says in that book, the Negro immediately needs, of course, shelter and food, but at the same time, we must make it possible for him to have unfettered communication with the stars. That's what we're talking about here. But it may be disingenuous to imagine, once again, that the ideal is fully in action and that it reflects a Sharada Muni who is as sanitized into a free spirit as she's divinized in the popular imagination. So on the one hand, we see the Bhadralok Sharada Muni divinized still, and on the other side, Ma. Zeitgeist is a time word indicating a thing susceptible to change. When we talk about people from outside the Euro-US culture, is usually a space word, given spatial names. I would like to think that Sharada Muni was also whirled around in a cultural matrix susceptible to change, played a part in the change, even as you and I are whirled around in our changeful timings. Everyone who writes about her carefully has this sense, Shushmita Ghosh most noticeably, but others too. I just want to see it without the obligation to buy the cliché narrative, which says things like imperialism gave us the novel and so on and so forth, which is Parthos and Shumit's, which is really a kind of male narrative and doesn't look at the fact that she inhabits a different kind of cusp. So I just want to see it without the obligation to either that narrative or to be a culturalist. My colleague, and I won't take her name because, she's a nice person, but anything I do, she will say, Indians do it. I've lived in this country for 47 years, and you can see how I mightily resist signifying myself as an Indian. I'm fond enough of the place to remain a citizen, but I'm very critical of the Republic of India. The citizen has the right. But this stand still thing, that culture is somehow it diagnoses everything that we do, or a divinist. I want to see this. So as I say, people, it is not as if I'm the first one to think this. It's just that I want to see it without stop. You cannot not see it. In other words, I want to see it without these three things that really stop research. One of the most unusual proofs of the sense of gender equality, and I'm using that word again in the interest of time, we can unpack it at in the Q&A, in this unusual couple was that shortly before his death, Godadhar told his wife that she should start initiating young men into the holy life. Swami Yogananda was her first initiated disciple. During Godadhar's lifetime, they had shared the responsibility of initiating a woman. This is a very peculiar story. Gauridasi into the holy life. Like Narendranath, Gauridasi was also from the colonial middle class. Godadhar and Sharada Muni, by their epistemic flexibility, remain in the economy of the rural and the urban, moving that way. And that's something that the skeptical historians, neither the skeptical historians nor the divinizers committed to divinization, pay enough attention to. By Akhay Chaitanya's count, Shahruda came to initiate 1,172 persons into the meditative life. The list spans a Hindi-speaking longshoreman in Bishnupur railway station. So she did it, he wanted it, she recognized his need, it was done. An unnamed Indian Eurasian woman and at least 4 persons from the United States, perhaps more. Although there have been female and initiating gurus in the Hindu tradition, they have usually been women who have left the comfort of family and household, and not invariably in the contemporary conjuncture, it's different, and have taken on the sacred habit and color. Shahruda was a young wife, and in the 1880s, giving this role to her was a highly unusual gesture. What was more unusual was that she rose to it. One of the reasons why she did say at a certain point, Ami me manush, I'm a woman, but that was just a kind of rhetorical statement, but then she went on. She rose to it. One of the reasons why I started with her secular name is that I did not want her to be confused with the many contemporary Indian women who have launched themselves into well-advertised rallies and trips for general initiation. We are speaking of a time when a married woman of her class and her limited education would cover her face with the edge of a sari in the presence of men, and in fact most of these people to whom she spoke, the men, spoke from behind, and she had her head covered by the edge of the sari, not a separate veil, and she would speak in that way. We are speaking of a time when a married woman of her class and her limited education would cover her face with the edge of a sari in the presence of men, and indeed not venture forth into public space, although to call this, quote, veiling may be slightly confusing. Let me show you a few photographs, and if I could have just the first one. About the first photo, very well known, many of you have seen this, it's the official photo. About the first photo, arranged by American women visiting India, Swami Gambhirananda has written, and I quote, "When Mrs. Oli Bull approached Holy Mother for her photograph, she declined because she was too shy to go to a studio and unveil her face in front of an unknown photographer. But when Mrs. Bull fervently requested, Holy Mother asked her to bring a woman photographer. As no woman photographer was available, she then asked her to bring a European photographer," and this was taken by Mr. Harrington. When the photographer arrived, Holy Mother, controlling her bashfulness, sat for a photo session. Sister Nivedita and Golapma arranged her cloth and hair according to their taste, with little divinization detail. There was a first photo, feet covered. So how can people have that as a shrine photo? Therefore, she's 46 years old here. So therefore, a second photo, as you can see at least 1 foot. On March 9, 1899, Sister Nivedita, Margaret Noble, an Irish woman, wrote to Mrs. Eric Hammond as follows. "You know that photograph meant the first time," I'm quoting, and I'm not translating obviously, "you know that photograph meant the first time she had ever looked straight at a grown-up man outside her own family, or been seen by one. Yet what self-consciousness was there? Not a grain. Neither Swami Vivekananda nor Sri Ramakrishna himself ever saw her unveiled. After her marriage, that is, when she was a little girl of 5. Incidentally, this happens not to be exactly correct. Gambhirananda records that in 1876, an itinerant female mendicant from Varanasi made her unveil herself in front of her sick husband, saying there were all these women going back and forth in Dakshineswar. It was a very interesting story of the role played by these women, and that's when it happened. So why is the European chosen here? It is well known that colonial cultures produce in the colonized a sense of inferiority. Was the view of the European therefore considered superior? Or was the European not considered quite a man, because not a Hindu, and therefore his gaze would not matter? There are many other permutations and combinations that one can imagine here. This is a moment that Gramsci would call an inventory without traces. I mention this because my father, as a young man of 21, was initiated by her in the last year of her life in 1920. By then she had been photographed many times by Indian men, Brahmacharis, B. Dotto, there are many pictures with her face, and those I'm going to show in a minute, just 4. And you'll see how different they are from the constructed photograph. There's one by Harrington, there's one by Van Dyck. They're very different from the others. My father was a reticent man, and I do not know what effect this had on him. I only remember him as a man in his late 40s who died at 55. If he had been alive today, I would have asked him how she managed the head covering at this point. At the time that he was alive, this seemed so natural. I mean, I can do it standing here. It's no problem at all, right? So it didn't occur. But now reading this, this is indeed a difference. How she managed the head covering. The interesting thing about the sari is that it is so free form. Of course, the way Shahruda wore it was a little different from the way a middle-class Indian woman wears it today. But nonetheless, the arrangement of the edge of the cloth on the head is in the woman's control. What were the details of her management of this, quote, veiling in the presence of men of different classes, colors, ages, propinquity? It is also known that she used the face cover as an evaluative instrument, and those who talk about the chador know very well that it is indeed instrumentalized. In many ways, we know many stories about that, but now is not the time once again. She used it as an evaluative instrument to avoid a group of young men who had simply come to see the Paramahansa's wife. She was no more than a fully covered bundle in the far corner of a veranda, a puntli. A far corner of a veranda. To welcome a young man who sought initiation, she stood at the door the next morning, face probably somewhat covered, avaguntito is not absolutely precise, hand to her cheek. This anecdote is recounted by the man in later life. Does this represent the managing of the zeitgeist? Even the most transcendentalized biographer of Shahruda has wondered at this. The journal Nibodhata, roughly be aware, know, as many of you much greater scholars than I am. I'm not an Indianist, I'm a Europeanist, but this is a tag, right? We all know Prapyavaran Nibodhata, know the rights that are owing to you. So this journal Nibodhata, roughly be aware, know, edited from the nunnery in her name, is running the annual theme of women's rights. These kinds of detail, the ones that I have just invoked, cover the micrological space between Shahruda Muni and this excellent theme, because we start not only from the spirit but also from the management of the body. Let's look at the other photos, and keep in mind that I'll tell you which one. Okay, that one is Sister Nivedita and Mother on the same occasion, Shahruda and Margaret Noble on the same occasion, okay? And then this one by Van Dyck, okay? Again, you see how she's, I don't have to comment. This one is by Bidotto. This is by a Bengali photographer, male, okay? This is her home. We visited it, my sister is in the audience, she and I visited it quite recently. This is her home. It's very different from the official photo. This is in Calcutta. So again, see that's the field of contradiction I'm talking about. And she inhabited them easily and happily. And this is late in life. This is the very last photograph that's commonly known. Okay. And then I just have one photo of Gadadhar, because it's a beautiful ecstatic photograph. You really catch, it's very, very well-known photos. You've seen these. You really catch the sense of the man much more than the posed photo that is worshipped. A very fantastic photograph. You want to turn the photos off. To give to her husband the secular name of Gadadhar Chattopadhyay is more transgressive. He was an ecstatic person, and in one of his ecstasies had said that Rama and Krishna were the same and lodged in his body. And so he is universally known as Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, the second word meaning the great swan. As water rolls off the swan's back, so sin cannot lodge on a swan, hence Paramahansa. In the family, he is universally referred to as Thakur, a name somewhere between master and lord, but in the altogether colloquial register, a word also used in the rural colloquial for a woman's father-in-law. By this familiar yet deeply respectful name, he is placed in a relationship that may correspond with the English language habit of addressing God as thou, the more familiar address. I seem not to be able to break that universal habit. Gadadhar is Ramakrishna from now on. I have elsewhere defined culture as, and I quote, a package of largely unacknowledged assumptions, loosely held by a loosely outlined group of people, mapping negotiations between the sacred and the profane by way of the relationship between the sexes, since in terms of sexual difference, because in order to create a semiosis, we need a difference, and that's the most, whatever difference you want to talk about, that's the most immediate difference materially accessible to people. This is how I have defined it very quickly for other people. This characteristic of cultural production is abundantly obvious in the assessment of this couple. On the devoted side, hardly anyone neglects to dwell lengthily on the fact that the marriage was not consummated. Ramakrishna himself spoke about his self-conscious decision to choose God over woman's body. In the more analytic accounts, Ramakrishna has been designated a homosexual because he had young male disciples. This line of discussion seems to me to be quite irrelevant. And, I'm not saying anything devoted here. I'm, in fact, reflecting also something that Foucault has said, that, somehow coming from the 19th century, we decided that the best way to find a person's inner being is to give it a sexual name. I think this line of discussion seems to me to be quite irrelevant. You cannot reduce an ecstatic relationship to a sexual name. I will set this aside. I will remember that he did not consider caste an indicator of human value, that he had wished to imagine himself a Muslim, a Christian, a woman. When she was 18, Ramakrishna worshipped her in a full ritual service, again very well known, behind closed doors as Paloharini Kalika, depositing his rosary beads and all the fruits of his devotional exercises at her feet, touching those feet at the end of the service. He was in ecstasy, and she too was somewhat out of herself. To begin the service, he decorated her feet with red dye, put vermilion on her forehead and hair part, and dressed her in new cloth. When later Ramakrishna's niece asked her, "You're so bashful, so how did he dress you? How did he get to dress you?" Sharuda answered, "I was every which way then. Ami tokhon kirokom jeno hoye gechilum." I've really not been able to translate this, so if there's anybody who understands colloquial rural Bengali, you'll see that I haven't got it much. Okay, so let's say I was every which way. Ami tokhon kirokom jeno hoye gechilum. This for me is the appropriate poetico-erotic statement of the relationship between this singular couple. Kirokom jeno. I don't quite know what way otherwise. Yet here too a contradiction, as she remembers the end of the ritual. I was watching everything, of course, but I did not want to talk, to speak. Kotha bolte koite chailam na, intending subject. So this is something that you see again and again, is what I'm trying to say. Ramakrishna was in the public eye a crazed priest at the temple of Kali, established by the local female landowner, Rani Rashmani. All men devoted to goddesses are supposed to, at least, entertain a certain degree of respect for mortal women. Alas, this is not always true. And in the worship of Kali, there was also the tradition of men worshipping women, Bhairavis, akin to the world-renouncing wandering women that I have described above. It is not clear to me if, within the custom of the worship of specifically the Paloharini Kali, there was an allowance of the worship of Bhairavis. And here I should acknowledge my debt to Tara Chatterjee, a considerable philosopher who has helped me with a lot of the research, and she too could not find as to whether the worship of Bhairavis was allowed within the worship of Paloharini. Incidentally, Tara Chatterjee is the person who gave the wrong judgment on the woman who hanged herself in Can the Subaltern Speak, woman in the family. So it is not clear to me if within the custom of the worship of specifically the Paloharini Kali, there was an allowance of the worship of Bhairavis. I am arguing, of course, that even if there was, Ramakrishna's reconstituting of his wife, 17 years his junior, living in the household in an affectionate, even playful relationship, as one such object of worship, was unusual, and it was seen as such. We must remember that Paloharini means roughly result removing, and refers specifically to karmapal or karmafal, the result of past work, positive or negative, the cycles of karma. Literally, if you worship the Paloharini Kali, she would remove all results of past work and liberate you, take away bad and good karma, in other words, in American English. She would remove all results of past work and liberate you. Ramakrishna said to her that he was depositing all his work, including his transcendental labors, at her feet. What shifting of responsibility is this? Does one identify the intending subject with the subject worshipping through the activation of ritual? The entire question of how you read bhakti. Bhakti is usually, Ramakrishna has been seen both as, wrongly I think, by scholars like Kripal as an active practitioner of Tantra, and bhakti itself is usually interpreted on the model of the European Reformation. But this is the question. Is it possible to identify the intending subject with the subject worshipping through the activation of ritual? But I want to make another suggestion here. Ramakrishna was a man of metaphor. Is it too fanciful to think that this worship undid the meaning of marriage as productive of offspring, or phala, also meaning fruit as in result? If only I could cathect in desire her soul as it received that worship. Again, the sign mother, unfortunately, allows the occlusion of the contempt for woman gold, Kamini Kanchan, that is in the permissible narrative for a man in the general culture. The sweetness of the relationship remains within this discourse and at the same time indicates an attempt to go beyond it by consensual celibacy. And we have to see that quite often friendship between a man and a woman makes of the woman an honorary male. So there has to be something of this. We can't ignore this. We are in a double bind here, well represented by the two quotations that follow. The first is Veena Das. The colonial assumptions about an unchanging Indian society led to the curious assemblage of Sanskrit studies with contemporary issues in most South Asian departments in the US and elsewhere. And the second is Jeremy Waldron. To congratulate oneself on following the norms of my community is already to take a point of view somewhat external to those norms, rather than to subscribe wholeheartedly to the substantive commitments that they embody. This last statement is never taken to apply to someone like Shahrudadevi, who was extremely self-conscious about these norms, turned them around, changed the way in which people would or would not, people should or should not follow them. This is supposed to be simply about contemporary cosmopolitanism. This is the problem that I'm talking about, and this is one of the problems that I have followed through for a very long time. For example, I said at one stage when we were reading some material from the Philippines, feminist material about labor, that we somehow do not give to her the same kind of license that we give to Heideggerian text. So to an extent, this sort of question I hope you will think about as a result of my putting Jeremy Waldron in here. I work, as Leila said, on cultural politics. I have to look with a critical eye at Merciamba Oduyoye's idea of the empowerment of African women through African cultural discourse, even as I am deeply sympathetic with her impatience. I must look at the published material to which I referred as something like Ranajit Guha's idea of the prose of counterinsurgency. Guha comments in his piece about the commitment to colonialism and makes a distinction between primary and secondary texts, asking, do the secondary texts also carry this commitment? I'm distinguishing the primary players in this cluster, Ramakrishna, Sharoda, Narendranath, and her three extraordinary woman companions, Gauri Dasi, Jogindra Mohini Bishwas, and Golapmani Devi, as dealing differently with the transcendental, whereas the secondary material seems committed to undisturbed divinization. Often, and it's so, commitment to colonialism, prose, he says, of counterinsurgency. I think we should try to take it somewhere else when we read a woman such as this. Often, an attempt to read the primary textuality of these people in another way is seen as Western influence. As I look at Judeo-Christian fundamentalisms in my living space, New York, New Jersey, California, and of course television, I find it hard to come to grips with such a dismissal. Again, I think of Du Bois, and I quote, "In the folds of this European civilization I was born and shall die, imprisoned, conditioned, depressed, exalted, and inspired." It is striking that she seems to have taken this act of worship with equanimity as her due. What is also striking, and this has been commented on, is the daily respect he gave to her, apologizing for having addressed her in the most familiar form, for example, thinking she was his niece, when he regularly addressed her by the middle form. Desexualized, she was a person for him. She was troubled by his ecstasies when she slept in the same bed. What does it mean to be troubled by ecstasies? She was later described as having ecstasies of her own. To my mind, this is to compute her by Godadhar's characteristics, even though she herself learned the mental moves well and computed herself in this way as well. To me, her signature is rational and ethical, although not, as in Shushmita Ghosh's dissertation, a completely unbroken middle class understanding of what it means to be rational and ethical. To me, her signature is rational and ethical. Her imagination and personality were strong enough to take on divinization at ease, but if we look at her, quote, sayings, we will see how rhetoric always manages her proud and untroubled declarations of a divine power and moves to the register of effortful ethical counsel. She was moved to the little musician's house by the banks of the Ganga. It is a tiny space, today full of light, with a marble floor. In her time, of course, completely enclosed with at best a brick floor. It is here that her famous prayer, looking up at the moon, has been given to us in her own words. Even the moon has blemishes. May my mind be free of blemishes. This is another characteristic of hers, emphasis on the mind, epistemological insistence, not just ethical. As I navigate through her sayings, I begin to think, even as I think that the couple together alter the definition of marriage, the difficult thing of friendship between man and woman, she herself also altered the signification of woman. No doubt the zeitgeist is whirling me around, you will judge. The brick floor, on the other hand, would be a playground. Aunt and niece, Lokhi and Sharuda, huddled together and slept there in the winter. Well before dawn, Ramakrishna would go to the riverside to relieve himself and clean himself. On the way back, he would urge his wife to get up and start her day. She would sometimes whisper on cold winter nights, Lokhi, let's pretend we are still sleeping. Dawn is far away, it is very cold. And he would slosh water under the door, laughing. Later, if she complained, also laughing and teasing, he would sing a wonderful folk hymn, which I translate here in the most inadequate of translations. Love waves have touched your body, earth receive, great love is flowing, and Gaur, the 15th century leader of the Bhakti movement in Bengal, is adrift in the waves. And a fantastic song. And I know at least Lou understands Bengali. You know this song undoubtedly, Dhara Lao, that extraordinary song. I try hard to excavate the playfulness of this unusual couple, defining marriage as not only the space of procreation and householding, even while inhabiting the zeitgeist. The idiom is very different from ours, of course, but here at least the imagination has some play. So an old question that I have asked in other contexts and been praised for, can we look at the excess space of pleasures? Must we look only at the restricted space of celibacy, even when consensual? Is it possible for people such as this? Narendranath Datta was 10 years younger than Sharuda Muni. As I have remarked above, he was a brilliant young law student. He could ride a horse, box, and engage in other civilized pursuits. He was excellent in debate. When he turned to Ramakrishna, coming to him via Hastie and Wordsworth, he retained his interest in the contemporary interpretation of Vedantic Hinduism, a philosophical monism that seemed to be more susceptible to an intellectual modernity. I here quote one of his many statements showing that Ramakrishna remained for him a contradiction that he could not rationalize. And just as, well, not quite just as, this is just an analogy, okay, let's not go too far with this comparison, it's not a comparison. You know, Gandhi takes off his suit and puts on his loincloth, okay? So, would you show me okay, so here you, no, not this one, but the next one. I can show it, okay, there. You see, this is 1886, he is 23 years old. Okay, he was, when you look at him, look at his house, you know, this is a deliberate gesture of entering that space. Okay, I'll show one more, which let me just show it right away, which is in London much later. This is much more like the society that he came out of, right? But that one, this is the contradiction that he himself speaks of, and I quote him. Brother, and he's writing to Swami Brahmananda, very close disciple of Ramakrishna. Brother, perhaps Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was a false thing. Perhaps taking shelter with him was an altogether wrong act. But what to do now? Maybe you will call this tedious, but this is my true word. It's hard to find someone as secularist as I in the world, but that little bit is my bigotry. Amar gorami. That little bit is my bigotry. Forgive me. Maybe I will see a big guru in my next life, this body that ignorant Brahmin has bought. Again and again, because it is a contradiction to what he did not go away from. And even in Belur, you can shut this now. Even in Belur, I mean, in his temple, you just have the Om, you don't have an image, right? So this, he acknowledged two things. One, that mother is greater. And here is the remark about Sharada Muni's superiority. You have not understood what substance our mother is. You will understand gradually. I'm quoting, I'm afraid if Ramakrishna Paramahamsa disappears, nothing is lost. If mother disappears, I'm not afraid if Ramakrishna Paramahamsa disappears, nothing is lost. If mother disappears, everything is lost. So to an extent, as he is maneuvering and manipulating the age from which he is produced, I'm making a real distinction between the way in which Ramakrishna instrumentalized the equality between a certain species of gender equality and the one that Vivekananda was doing. And in his eyes, and this has been noticed by others, and maybe I should just simply read on because I say it and I'm now I think about 50 minutes. Yet there is a great distance between Sharada Muni's material world and Narendranath's. In 1897, Narendranath, by then a monk with the name of Swami Vivekananda, returned from the Congress of Religions held in Chicago in 1893. He was tremendously successful in Chicago, and in his tour of the United States and Europe, this is how Sharada Muni's sister-in-law describes the absolutely implausible scene of absolutely implausible, of Vivekananda coming to Sharada Muni to make his obeisance as she stands there with her veil, lying prone before her. I quote the sister-in-law. In appearance like a king, he lay down straight and narrow on the feet of Thakurji. Thakurji is a colloquial word describing her sister-in-law as father-in-law's daughter. Okay, Thakurji. He lay down straight and narrow on the feet of Thakurji, clasped his hands together and said, Mother, I made the white man's boy a horse by your grace. Tomar kripaye sahebe cheleke ghoda baniyeti. Now this is not usually quoted, but this thing of the sister-in-law commenting on this absurd scene of this incredibly, you saw the guy falling in that way, that should give us a sense of the distance between the two worlds. It was this man who wanted immediately to establish a women's association, directed by Sharada Muni, recruiting the women who were her companions. Nimai Sadhan Bose, whom I have already cited, says something interesting about this. He argues that Vivekananda was ahead of his time in suggesting this, and that although the other disciples of Ramakrishna were deeply respectful of Sharada Muni and accepted her as the head of the Ramakrishna order, which they had themselves established, they thought the time for such a project had not yet arrived. Professor Bose offers an analysis of this difference of opinion and its possible reasons. I quote, although they welcomed and supported the idea of establishing a women's organization, they did not think that the field and the mental preparation were as yet available. The only one who thought otherwise was Vivekananda. Here again one asks the question of how to compute influence. It is all too easy to read Vivekananda's idea as a westernization resulting from colonialism. Reversing it, the Cambridge historians have suggested that capitalism had already advanced in India enough that colonialism was almost not the oppressive phenomenon that most sentimental intellectual workers have suggested. On the other hand, there are also efforts to show that just before the colonial encounter, India had epistemologically advanced far enough to march towards a modernity that would not fully resemble the European one. Predictably, I find it difficult to inhabit this polarization, especially when it concerns gender difference. I would like to think that the already existing episteme had some things in it which found supplementation by colonialism, in a class-divided way, with whatever attendant violence. It is not mimicry, nor is it influence on a cause and effect scenario. What would have happened counterfactually if the colonial encounter had not given it a definite shape does not seem to be relevant in the assessment of individual choices. I distinguish then between Ramakrishna, who was an ecstatic and original man of metaphor, easily moving from affective epistemic position to position, with a certain degree of shrewdness, and Narendranath, who was trained to work on what he could glean in the zeitgeist. Sharada Muni, as I have insisted, had no institutional training in thinking the correct thing. On the other hand, she mightily welcomed the waves of change and rode them. We must know how to read this riding. She is the opposite of those I see all around me who have learned how to express politically correct opinions but show no internalized change. Look, for example, at a couple of interesting contradictions. In a much-quoted utterance, she describes how they fed the famine-stricken poor folks in 1865, irrespective of caste. Immediately after this, she praises the fact that her father-in-law obeyed caste rules in eating. In an extraordinary statement, she says, I quote, "People come to me and say, 'No peace in life. I did not see God. How will I have peace, mother?' They say so many things. I then look at them, and I look at myself, and I think, why do they speak so? Is everything of mine transcendental? Amar ki shokoli alaukik? Is everything of mine transcendental? I never saw anything as a lack of peace. And seeing God, it's in my grasp. I can see whenever I sit down." End of quote. Look at the rhetoric of uncertainty about her own transcendentality, and then the confident assertion of seeing God. It is too delicate and can be easily ignored, and then one would miss the management of the shuttle between a confident intelligence and acceptance of divinization, the conflict between the discursive field of the urban organization and the permissible narratives of the Dvaita structure of feeling. As always, my effort is to read this play, Raymond Williams's archaic, residual, dominant, emergent, oppositional alternative in each moment of culture as process. Her pre-emergent is our world. This is Williams's most incredibly mysterious and wonderful idea, the idea of the pre-emergent. And in talking about the zeitgeist and so on, that this is what I would like to say. In closing a piece called Moving Devi, which is now a chapter in my book Other Asias, I wrote, and you'll see how that was the first take, and I'm coming to an end, and this is the second take, and it hasn't worked. But anyway, this is what I wrote. Shahrudadevi was a village girl who could read some but not write. She was married at 5, joined her husband at 18, and then was drawn into celibacy and the circuit of a tremendous assembly of male colonial subjects who gave her reverence and worshipped her often, avataric husband. In her own life's detail, in the everyday detail of her marriage, she needed self-consciously to call upon the resources of the Dvaita episteme in the most concentrated way. We have bits and pieces of her exquisite utterances as testimony. This remarkable woman outlived her husband by 34 years. In the course of time, his 12 young male disciples established her as the advisory head of an organization that became a monastic order devoted to social work. She performed her role with tact and wisdom, always remaining in the background. Her husband had worshipped her ritually, officiating as his own priest. It is one of her ice-cold sayings that haunt me, a questioning of the right to possessing the other and of self-determined identity at once. I quote, "Action befitting the situation, consequences befitting the person, gifts befitting the recipient. No one is anyone's dear, no one is anyone's." Paradoxically, this admonition without an imperative describes without moralism the passing of the Dvaita habit of seeing. Vivekananda, Ramakrishna's chief disciple, wrote a Sanskrit hymn to her. The addressers in the plural are grammatically in the masculine gender. My female cousin and I, when we sang the hymn together in Calcutta in the 50s, quietly changed the gender of the collective singers to feminine, perhaps simply because we were two women in canting. Last year in New Delhi, the female religious order founded in her name sang the hymn on her birthday. They had not disturbed Vivekananda's grammar. The collectivity of nuns spoke in male gendering. Shahrudadevi had become a Devi, a goddess, the Dvaita gaze frozen in the artifice of a forever present standing in for eternity. I did not accept this earlier. Writing in this essay, I have tried to open up those last sentences and defrost her gaze into her humanity and her singularity. They were, by the way, Asiya Jabbar does this with the Lacroix's women of Algiers in their apartment. Says, we've got to defrost them. They were women by themselves, her group, making sense of their lives within a general culture of reproductive heteronormativity. Yes, the world was her children, but if we think of it only as a palliative substitute, we underestimate her, I think. She dressed as if she was still of a couple, a sari with a border, bangles on her wrists, long hair. It took some doing as a widow in a village. If we think of it only as a palliative declaration that Ramakrishna was forever alive, we underestimate her, I think. The singular is not the individual, nor the particular. The singular is universalizable. All I can do is note the singularity. For me, universalization is a case-dependent praxis. Vivekananda wrote that he would let everything go but the universal. You judge the difference. This is where these ongoing efforts began. I thank the William James Committee for allowing me to speak of this. I have to think of this effort as work in progress. The role of what I think of my foremothers is important to me. The only way that I can think of Sharada Muni, hope to be haunted by her, is through this warp and woof of a secularized modernity. The effort is perhaps undone already by the unthinking egalitarianism of the Internet. Look in closing at a MySpace I found on the Internet, and I don't find it amusing at all. And note the details which I will quote. If this is the future of democracy, the secularists should hold their fire. Okay, gender female, status married, age 102. Obviously the person doesn't even know that she was born in 1853, they've just put it in. Sign Aquarius, country United States. Send message, contacting Shahrudadevi, send message, forward to friend, add to friends, etc. General, devoted wife and disciple of Shahrudadevi's interests, general. Devoted wife and disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. My role in life is to be a leader of the Ramakrishna order. Music, Avatar bhajans, hymns to the goddess, Hari Om Ram Nam, Gita Govinda Mala, Shakti bhajans, Guru bhajans, Bhajananda. Movies, Krishna. Groups, lovers of God by any name. View all Sharada Devi's groups. Sharada Devi's detailed status married, religion Hindu. Sharada Devi's networking, marketing, online marketing, hospice. Now, as I say, one can go on and say that this is going to spread her name among people and welcome it as an empire, as a harbinger of democracy. What I've been trying to say is that even the ecstatic language of divinization or the celebratory language of a middle-class feminism doesn't do justice to this extremely complex text of the woman inhabiting a contradiction different from the two men who allowed her forthrightness to emerge. I think it's a great misfortune if this kind of unthinking so-called egalitarianism then simply transforms her into an interesting object for young Americans. Thank you.
Professor Spivak has kindly agreed to take some questions and answer some questions, so I'll turn it back over to her to recognize those.
Thank you. Gosh, it's hot in here. I'll wait until the people who have to leave. You see why I said she's defeated me. I'm sure many people expected, especially the younger ones, for me to theorize more. But it's not possible at this point. You theorize more, you've lost it. It's the same as the problems of divinization and so on. I got to listen more, I got to hang around more. So it's, as I said, I would share my failure with you. So do instruct me, ask me some questions. Yes.
I'm just interested by your statement, the singular is universalizable. Yeah. I wondered if you could expand that at all.
Yes, I, of course, learned to say that, and in this room there must be people who know Spinoza infinitely better than I do, so I won't even go there. But I learned to say that through, trying to read Spinoza a little, trying to read the commentary on Spinoza that comes out of, people in my neck of the woods, people like Negri, people like Balibar, people like that. I'm not a philosopher. But the idea of solving through the notion of the repeatable difference, the problem of the one and the all in ethical practice, it seems to me, and that's what I'm talking about, so that one doesn't simply look at that which can be called human. I mean, I think in the field of human rights, this is an interesting and important thing to remember, difference that can be repeated, so that one doesn't celebrate every difference and fall into a kind of particularism. That's why I said that it's not particular. So it's a very hard thing to do. And like most of these kinds of decisions, it's without guarantees. And it's not irrational. But on the other hand, it acknowledges that we are not only made reasonably. So it seems to me that that's what I'm marking there, in the interest of... But on the other hand, you see, I was looking at singularity also in concrete ways. I don't think you can just make a distinction between that which is universalizable and between that which is concrete and will fall short of it. So that's what it was. This is not a full answer. It would take a long time, and I would have to work at it a little more because I'm not a philosopher. But that's where it comes from. Is there anybody, in fact, here who can say a little bit of something about singularity in Spinoza and instruct this, give a real answer to this question? Well, perhaps at the reception, because I don't want to put you on the spot. But when you come forth, don't say I was wrong. Teach me. Okay, that's a way of dealing with it, which, excuse me if I use the word male in a very horrible kind of sexist way, but just for convenience, like this is another way of dealing with a speaker's mistake. I really don't know enough. So if you would like to tell me a little more, instruct me. Okay, what else?
I don't want to ask you to be more of a philosopher. Well, first, let me just say really very extremely interesting talk, and would like to hear it several more times that I could catch everything that you were saying. But I was trying just to track or appreciate how the transcendental was functioning for you. And you said something in the beginning that seemed to indicate something about its importance, perhaps in some philosophical way, I'm not sure.
Yes.
But that it functions something like as a limit. But then it seemed, as you went on, you certainly were equating it with her divinization. That has a lot to do with it. And then something about the instrumental way in which it's being deployed by her and by others. Is that all that it is instrumentally deployed in your economy of how you're understanding her strategy, or is there something else there too?
You put your finger on exactly what I will have to get at the next time around. This is wonderful. Thank you. Now, let me again give a short, blunt answer. You see, the transcendental, when I talk about it as a limit, I really think of, and remember I am a Europeanist, I really think of Kant's transcendental deduction. And that passage in the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant corrects Locke and says that there are certain things which you must take for granted, for which, and these are Kant's words translated into English, you can't bring legal evidence forward. It's a limit, yes? And when, for example, in the appendix of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant talks about the fact that the ideas of pure reason cannot be accessed by the understanding, and he has those analogies, and the analogy is to sense perception, because the manifold must be made into something that has a shape in order for experience to be possible. So that, to an extent, philosophizing is, Kant would kill me if, first of all, I don't exist in Kant's world, and second of all, he would kill me if for what I'm just now going to say. But if I can do that with Shahrudadevi, I can do it with Kant as well. That, to an extent, it is a kind of managed, intended mistake, philosophizing, because of the way that fractured subject, which Kant never acknowledged was fractured, the way in which is the 18th century intuition, much more complicated than the clock, the way in which the fractured subject actually is programmed, Anlage is programmed to access the ideas of pure reason. So that's where I get my notion of the transcendental as a limit from, if the singular is from Spinoza. And I know Kant just a tad better. I'm ignorant and completely incapable of philosophizing, but nonetheless, I've read a little bit more. See, German's easier than Latin. But at any rate, that's where the limit comes from. When I talked about literature, that is really much simpler. It is the ability to entertain in the imagination, and this is not necessarily the complicated 18th century notion. I'm just now writing on Schiller's aesthetic education. The ability to, and kind of dismissing it in some ways, the ability to entertain in the imagination something that is not necessarily believed in. I don't think Coleridge's idea, and I've written this for those of you who read Moving Devi, do forgive me, the Coleridge's notion of the willing suspension of disbelief is in fact not really there. It's not a willing suspension of anything. It's in fact the development of a reflex. And this has some kind of a relationship with the way in which the ethical interrupts the epistemological, because you don't know enough about, you cannot, this is why the Millennium Goal stuff troubles me greatly. You cannot know everything about a situation and do the right thing. So that's where the literary, much more fuzzy, hangs out for me. And I felt, since I was talking about the Dvaita universe, and remember, I'm not an Indianist, I am Indian, and I'm deeply interested in these questions. It's a kind of family connection too. So there's much that anybody who works in that area can teach me and tell me. But nonetheless, it seems to me that when you come to the religious transcendental, and I'm not doing English there, I'm doing Bengali, and dealing with just as with Kant, I'm doing German, right? So I'm a comparative literature person, a language person. So when I'm doing that, I'm really thinking of that word alaukik. Alaukik, lok, phenomenal, and alaukik, the adjective transcendental. So, but the adjective is not a transcendental, it's awe. It's the negative, okay? Awe is simply the negative, right? So therefore, there's a complication there. But nonetheless, I think what we are talking about in the Dvaita mindset is what a Europeanist like me would call some kinds of an ontological commitment, which is a bit different from either the transcendental deduction of philosophy or the detranscendentalizing persistence of the imagination in the interest of, in the literary. So that's what, I mean, in a word, which is 150 words, that's how I would answer your fantastic question. But remember, I haven't worked it out. That's where the working out will have to try a little harder next time.
I just want to add the question, though, and you don't have to answer it, and I'll wait here when we work it out. But what I was interested is how does this then work out in Shahrudadevi's life? So in what you were talking, I can get something of your theoretical, how you're describing it, but I wasn't quite sure how strategically it was deployed by her in the plans that you were celebrating.
You see, it seems to me, again, remember, this is unfinished work, and my sister knows that I said again and again that if I can't do it this time around, I'll just give my talk on secularism. But the thing, I feel that I have not been able to do it, but it was too late to put the secularism talk together, okay? So I'll have to deal with this more carefully when I do it again. But it does seem, what I'm trying to say is that I have not encountered anybody writing on that space of the Bengali encounter with colonialism. I mean, you know, they came in through Bengal, right? And people, 1757, people do acknowledge that, I mean, not just Partha Chatterjee, but people like Victor Kiernan, that they didn't quite know, and at first it wasn't a territorial conquest. And we know these things. These are sort of potted history, as it were. So to an extent, the way in which it happened was a little bit different from, by the time, certainly different from Africa, and even different from the rest of India. So, but what one has heard about how this influence came about, first of all, the only way in which we think about women is this kind of women becoming colonial subject, writing autobiographies, etc., sometimes becoming a doctor. And, these are wonderful women. I'm not denigrating them. But I find in this woman actually a phenomenon which is related to that zeitgeist, that historical conjuncture. But because what we look at when we study folks like this is the permissible narratives that are available to one to describe what's going on, and also the ways in which assent is given to a semiotic field that is before, and so on. So it seems to me that the play, this is too simple now, remember I really have to work at it more. It seems to me that the play of the Dvaita access to the transcendental, I mean, if one looks at her sayings, it's amazing how completely it is written within belief in this kind of Dvaita stuff, which you would never see in Shushmita Ghosh or anybody who's trying to simply lift her into an example of this kind of rational universal motherhood. So that permissible discourse which affects belief, because as far as we are concerned, there's a simple thing to say, belief is not just in things, right? Belief is managed and manipulated by language. And so that stuff, and at the same time, a tremendous intelligence accessing a certain kind of rationality which questions, and helped by these two very different kind of men who more or less kind of opened it. Okay? This phenomenon has not been studied at all. So therefore, I said that she's a field of contradictions. Generally what happens is it's swamped with this foregone conclusion of either maternalism or divinization. I mean, this is not a literature department, but someone here has, and perhaps many ones, have read Tilly Olsen's Tell Me a Riddle. I mean, it's really worth looking at that. It's that kind of a problem. So, but next time around, I mean, I'm not going to publish this soon. It's going to have to find itself in another way, but thanks. So, is that it? Wonderful. Thank you so much.